the way I've tried to frame this presentation is, if you're sitting around with family members, or you're chatting to someone who's from outside of London, and you want to explain what poverty is and they don't really know, I'm hoping this sort of narrative here, which combines the numbers with a bit of the story we like to tell at the Trust for London, will help you sort of do that, really. And a lot of these graphics are taken from the report that we published in 2020, or the website itself. So I'm going to sort of pull out what I think of are the sort of salient facts about poverty, and about why poverty in London is at the level it's at. So the first and probably the most well-known point around poverty in London is that we have the highest poverty rate in the UK. That's around 28% of the city lives in poverty, and here you've got comparators with other areas of the UK, and you can see, particularly inner London there, when you zoom in on that, just how high it is. And a lot of people outside London find this surprising, because they believe London is an area, a city which is full of prosperity, wealth, and perhaps when they conceptualize poverty, or the stereotype of poverty, they're thinking more about sort of northern industrial, post-industrial towns, and those sorts of areas, rather than sort of the poverty that we see in London today. They're also probably got very stereotypical images of what that poverty looks like, and it's probably quite different to the vast levels of in-work poverty we are seeing across the country and in the city today there. But that's the sort of the first big point. That's 2.5 million people. That's a sort of significant amount of people. I'm going to talk about the definition of poverty on the next slide. But this is the thing we like to remind people of all the time, particularly in some of the sort of policy and political debates that are around levelling up. We thought, that agenda, we didn't know whether it would come back so sort of strongly post or during COVID, but obviously it is coming back, and we'll see more of that sort of being said over the coming months and years, I'm sure. But just a little note on the definition of poverty. So there are several ways in which you can measure poverty, and we use this sort of international standard. It's a relative measure of poverty, so that means poverty is being measured as it is in comparison to today, rather than compared to 100 years ago, or comparing it to a different country, or what have you. And we define it as it's defined as 60% of median income after housing costs. So the after housing costs is really important. You can also measure it before housing costs, and I'll show you some of those in the presentation today. But the reason we do it after housing costs is because housing is an unavoidable thing. We can't avoid it, and if you don't include it, it really skews the nature of who we view as potentially in poverty or not, given that everyone has to pay. Now, everyone's always interested in like a number. So what is that? How much do I have to earn to not be in poverty, or to be in poverty? And the answer to that is not straightforward. So I think the median income in London's, I think, 36 odd thousand pounds. I think in the UK it's about £28,000. You can't just take 60% of that and say, okay, fantastic. If I earn under £18,000, that means I'm in poverty. Because if you're a single person earning £18,000, it's very different to being a household with 2 children earning £18,000. So economists do what they call equivalization. They try and iron out some of those differences to come up with the overall poverty number. But it does mean it's quite hard to put a single figure on, but the cash number you have to earn. But what we have here is a graph. This isn't one of ours. This is from Joseph Rowntree Foundation's sort of annual poverty report, and it does give you some indication here of the kinds of wages people need to earn, income people need to earn to not be in poverty. The column here on I'll focus on these two first. The column here is the sort of UK poverty line. So you can see how it differs for different household compositions. And JRF also give a sort of a number for destitution, and that is, sort of really being in deep persistent poverty and not being able to meet your basic needs. And that's sort of the income brackets there. Here we have, some other measures that we use at the Trust, and the JRF also use, and particularly around the minimum income standard. So there is the poverty definition as put here, around 60%. But there are also other ways of looking at sort of living standards more broadly. And those of you who haven't come across the minimum income standard, do look at our website. It's a fantastic report. And what it does is it ask ordinary members of the people to come to, ordinary members of the public to come together in a room and to discuss what does a minimum acceptable standard of living look like. And they'll debate it, they'll come to a sort of a conclusion, and then the researchers will go off and literally just price up all of those things in a big budget spreadsheet. They'll look at the cost of shopping at Asda or buying your clothes from various outlets, or going out for a meal once a week at Nando's or whatever it is that people have agreed to, and they'll put a figure on it. And what you can see here is obviously it's when you ask the members of the public, the minimum level they think you should have per week is obviously a lot higher than the sort of poverty line. And we like to remind people of that. We shouldn't just be aspiring to the poverty line, we should be aspiring to being able to participate fully in society as others would expect, which is what the minimum income standard is. Again, just focusing on some of the maps here, it's a fairly sort of basic point to make, but it's worth making, that poverty is not equally distributed across the city. One second, sorry. And here we have two maps, one on the left here using those estimates I talked about earlier about borough level poverty. Again, that's from 2014. And I use the IMD one on the right here, which I showed you in the live demo, as a comparison because it's a bit more recent. You can see not much has really changed. Highest levels of poverty are really in that sort of central area, in that northern corridor coming out to the east here. And you still have the sort of leafy suburb stereotype happening in and around sort of these areas. And what we've seen over the past 10 years or so is a bit more of a convergence between inner and outer London. So I think if you'd have come at this sort of 15, 20 years ago, you'd have seen much more red in and around the centre. It's been spreading out a little bit, I think largely due to, we don't know how much of it is about people moving out or about costs going up in those areas, but I presume a lot of it is about housing costs going up in those areas, rental costs in particular. So you can see a consistent picture here about where poverty is located. But it's really important. London is not one big city. It's many areas, and people in poverty living very close in proximity to people of quite high levels of wealth. So obviously poverty impacts different demographic groups differently, and we can see here which ones fare the worst in London. Some sort of well-known stats there: 4 in 10 children in London, as was mentioned at the beginning in sort of the intro. Another sort of big, often overlooked demographic group is single-parent families, which are very, very severely impacted by the high cost of living and their limited ability to earn income because of their family situation or the flexibility of their employment market and other such barriers. And disabled people, sort of a significant number of disabled people living in poverty, and we do lots of work on this, recognizing again, it's not always the group people think of when they talk about poverty. Often, I mean, ethnicity, gender, age come out a bit more off the tip of the tongue, but disability is absolutely up there, and we really need to do more on making it visible. And 25% of working age adults in London are living in poverty, and that again has been sort of another shift I'll talk about, away from the sort of 1980s, 1990s style conception of poverty being about being out of work. May well be going back that way, we'll see, to being about being in work and not having enough, not getting paid enough, and also having very, very high costs of living. And on this graph here, you've got that breaking down a bit more. I just want to focus on the BME line here, because as I said earlier on, we're often asked about more data on different groups, and this one is the one that people ask about the most. These are ONS, Office for National Statistics, sort of labels, and we don't have the sort of depth of data to be able to unpick it much more than this around poverty rates. There are some around the employment rates, which I'll talk about in a second, but really, I mean, we can't put BME groups in BME communities in one big category there, and we would provide more granularity if we could, but we just don't have access to the large enough sample sizes to do that. But again, if you're talking to someone who's living outside London, they'll be like, well, what's the issue in London? I mean, you've got so many jobs, a lot of them are well paid. You see, we've got 20% of the jobs in England. You can just see here how over the past sort of 15, 20 years or so, how well the employment levels have gone up. So it's not, people are getting employed. it's an issue about the fact that often those jobs do not pay enough or offer enough progression for people to progress out of sort of poverty. And you see unemployment rates lowering, economic inactivity rates lowering, and that's people who may be retired or on long-term sick, or students, or looking after their home. So all the traditional employment and labour market indicators look very good for London, but obviously that's in conflict with what we know about poverty. And yeah, that is for two reasons. One is there are still lots of people who can't find work, and if you you have lower qualifications levels, you're much more likely to be unemployed than if you have higher qualification levels. Again, a very sort of intuitive point. We all know it really, but it's worth ensuring that when we think we know it, it's backed up by the data. And we know different demographic groups are impacted differently by being workless. And here, this is one of those indicators where we do have a bit more granularity on the ethnic groups. Here, obviously, you have this big bucket, which is other ethnic groups, which is sort of a bit annoying. But you can't disaggregate that, unfortunately, sort of anymore. And you see Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and the other groups sort of faring worse than some of the other groups there. But the real story around poverty in London is one about being in work and essentially not getting paid enough, and not getting paid enough, combined with very, very high cost of living. So 44% of people in poverty are working. I think when we talk about the stereotype, how people conceive poverty, they really don't think about in-work poverty. They think about workless poverty, and that's something we really have to work on to make it understand, and to help people understand that being poverty is often about working, and that's a window into that world is not often given when you talk about mainstream media and how they talk about this stuff. And it's higher in London here than it is in England there, which is where it's sort of 39% or so. And the graph on the right just shows you sort of comparison. So at the bottom here, you have unemployed and in poverty. So unemployed, definition of that is you're out of work, but you're seeking work. That's why it's at the bottom here. And at the top, you have sort of economic inactivity, as I said, sort of people who are retired and long-term sick, and students and so forth. And then you have this steady rise going up here on the graph around in-work poverty. And this, this sort of steady rise is generally what you kind of see. Sometimes you see these sort of movements up and down, but it's often these sorts of trajectories. In-work poverty is concentrated in certain industries. You've seen the sort of the conditions of sort of COVID key workers been raised quite a bit in the media, and I think that's kind of cut through with the general public. And you can see here that sort of over half the people in in-work poverty in London are in one of the top 4 industries there on the graph, many of which will have been working on the front line during the pandemic. And we're certainly keen that we are funded more policy work on modern day key workers and what can be done to make sure that their settlement post-COVID is as it should be. And so part of it is, part of it's about unemployment, but part of it is about not earning enough. And you can see that income inequality in the city. So this is essentially your pay packet, the inequality in pay packets that people have has been rising, and it's massively out of whack with the rest of England here. So 10 times basically the top income percentile of the top 10 take 10 times as much as the bottom 10, which is just a staggering amount when you compare it to it's about five times in the rest of England, and something which should concern us all really. There was some positive news. I hazard that sort of COVID might have affected this, but the sort of latest data on pay rises was showing that those at least in the bottom decile, so that's in the bottom 10%, were seeing their incomes improve and hourly income improve at a faster rate than some of the other groups. But it's not just about the bottom 10%. You can see here in some of the bottom, in the next 10%, 10% of that, it's still quite low compared to those in the highest rate. And we'd imagine this has been negatively affected by COVID. And most of that is about the sort of national minimum wage and the London living wage. But if you want the one takeaway to tell someone when they ask you about poverty in London, why is it so bad? Unfortunately, it is about housing. The cost of housing in the city is I think the primary driver of poverty, and I'm going to show you a couple of stats which should drive that through really. First is, as mentioned earlier on, so if you're in poverty, you're spending over 56%, over half of your income is going on your housing. Now, if you're in poverty in the rest of England, it's about 37%. So it's about 4 in 10 again. That's a magic number. So you're spending 20% more of your income in London on your housing, which is a phenomenal amount when you're on sort of very modest income. And here on the right, you can see just how important social housing is to try and address that as a policy challenge. So if you're in the private rented sector, which is this column here on the left, and this is the lower quartile, so that's the bottom end of the market. The difference between that and what you pay in social housing or even with just affordable rent is massive, and it would make all the difference. So this is the big salient fact. Housing in London is the primary driver of poverty. And if you want to, again, this proves that in my eyes, really. If you look at before housing costs, so I mentioned earlier on that poverty isn't often measured after housing costs. Well, we have a measure which is before housing costs. So if you measure before housing costs, London actually has a lower poverty rate than the rest of England. It's 15%, whilst the rest of England is 17%. So you can see London here on the 15% is lower than the 17% here. And it's housing which pushes this obviously up here as well, but this up by so much further in London than the rest of England. And again, if you're sort of looking at 1980s, 1990s style poverty, you'd have been talking about what was called council housing and stereotyped by estates in those days. Still probably stereotyped in that way, but very much now, due to the sort of lack of supply of that kind of housing, poverty is concentrated in the private rented sector. You can see that demonstrated here in this sort of large leap up here, and the sort of move down in social rented accommodation and the move down in sort of owner occupiers as buying a house becomes much more difficult in London. And finally, on housing, it's really important to make this point around temporary accommodation. It's an area we hope to be working a lot more on going forward. So-called temporary accommodation, because we know that many of these people and often their families are in this sort of substandard temporary accommodation for up to 2 years maybe, and there's been a big increase in the number of households living in temporary accommodation in the last 30 years or so. Something again we're thinking, as the focus at the moment is largely on preventing evictions, which is really important, but also on the street homeless and the fact that many of those have been provided accommodation and how that can be made a permanent solution. We shouldn't lose sight of those families living in these and individuals living in temporary accommodation. And the final, one of the final points is around wealth. So as I said, the narrative around London being a city of prosperity and wealth has very much taken hold. It's often why people outside of the city don't like the city itself or how they view Londoners. But clearly, wealth in London is very unequally distributed. So the wealthiest, sort of 42% of the wealth, and the bottom 10% hold nothing. Often they'll have negative wealth, so they'll have nothing and be in debt. And you know, it's really important to keep on reinforcing this point. And the primary driver of this here is housing. So if you own a house, your wealth levels, you know, particularly if you've owned your house for a while, will be going through the roof. But I'm going to stop on the numbers there. Again, I talked a little bit about the Trust for London at the beginning. What I didn't say is how we're trying to address some of this. What we see here in our funding programs, and on the right, you've got a bit of an overview of the strategy which guides our funding, which is related very much to some of the issues we've seen here around housing, around the state of our employment, particularly for low-paid people, issues around wealth inequality, and around the cost of living and living standards and migration as well. So there's sort of a lot on our website to digest. As I said earlier on, I showed you the website. If you go to the website, you can just access a lot more of this data. And I will stop there.